me take as my text, as a preacher would say, this from Brian Edwards, The History, Civil and Commercial of the British Colonies in the West Indies. Brian Edwards was a planter, a figure in the West Indies, in Jamaica, and he had this to say: "Who would believe that woollens constitute an article of great consumption in the torrid zone? Such, however, is the fact. Of the coarser kinds especially, for the use of the Negroes, the export is prodigious." And I think this has to be absolutely right. If we consider the scale of the market and the dynamism of the market in the Caribbean, we can start to appreciate just how important woollens that are made for enslaved workers were. Now, here are some figures. These are projected, reasonably accurate figures for the population of, firstly, the British Caribbean, secondly, British North America, and if you then multiply that by a notional 4 yards per person, which is, I think, quite a conservative estimate, you can see how the consumption of so-called Negro cloth absolutely zooms up, particularly in the second half of the 18th century. So this is not something marginal, this is not something that's minor, it's a very, very important part of British wool production in the 18th century, very important market. Question is, where does all this fabric come from? And contemporary accounts seem to suggest there are three principal areas which produced Negro cloth, as it was called. Yes, here we are. Firstly, the Lake District. This was where a thing called Kendal cotton was produced. Again, we know exported in large quantities to British North America. Secondly, the West Riding of Yorkshire, the home of Penistone, so-called after the large, really large moorland parish of that name. We know a great deal of Penistones were exported to the New World market. And lastly, what interests us today is Welsh Plains, a thing produced principally in Montgomeryshire, also in Merionethshire. So what we have there is a kind of three moorland, upland areas, wet, quite cool, mostly devoted to pastoral agriculture, that are increasingly orientated on producing textiles for New World enslaved markets. And this was remarked upon at the time. I think, Marion, you mentioned earlier on Thomas Pennant. Here he is, he's touring Wales from about the era of the American Revolution, and he has this to say: the flannel manufacture, and that of coarse cloth for the army and for covering the poor Negroes in the West Indies, is manufactured in most parts of the county. It is sent and sold in the rough to Shrewsbury. Absolutely correct, because Shrewsbury were where the important finishing operations took place. Principally the shearing of cloth to produce an even nap, an even surface on the cloth, and then probably sent on to London if it was to be dyed. Most stuff that went to the West Indies wasn't dyed, but if Welsh plains that were to be dyed would have had that carried out in London, I suspect. This wasn't widely known to planters in the Americas themselves. They weren't really aware of where this material came from. Where's Negro cloth come from? And it came to quite a surprise to them that it was coming from Wales. We have testimony for this. This is the testimony of a man called Elias Ball. The Ball family were major planters in South Carolina, the most brutal slave society in British North America. And during the American Revolution, the Ball family is divided. Some of them are patriots, some of them are loyalists. The ones who are loyalists do the sensible thing at the end of the war. They go into exile in England. Elias Ball ends up in Bristol, and then he discovers, writing back to a nephew of his who was on the patriot side, I know where I can get you some Negro cloth. I've inquired about this, have inquired about Negro cloth. The great market for that article, I find, is at Shrewsbury, the capital of Shropshire. And this is backed up by other American commentators at the time. Let's take the word of Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence is a major figure in American Revolutionary history. Adam, I'm going to look to you now. Was he a signatory of the Declaration of Independence? I think he was. I mean, he helped negotiate the Peace of Paris, I think. He's a big name anyway in American revolutionary politics. He's also a merchant before the war in Charleston, South Carolina, and Charleston is the antechamber to this vicious slave society in the Carolina Low Country. He reports back to his business associates in Charleston, I'm going to find out something about Negro cloth. I shall set out for Shifnal and shall be at Shrewsbury. At those places I'll get to go to the bottom of the Welsh Plain article, and his correspondence, which is published in many volumes because he is such an important figure in early American politics, returns to this again and again. Shall inspect such parcels as are in London warehouses tomorrow or next day. If I don't succeed in this attempt, I shall try Mr. Fowler of Shrewsbury is now in town and will be glad to deal with me. Well, are we going to export some of this stuff or not? Yes, parcels of planes are expected hourly from Wales, and I'm going to load some of these on my ship, the Magna Carta, that will be setting off to Charleston. This is 1774, the eve of the war. And here we are, yes, what bales of white plain on your account. Mr. Harrison, the London guy, expects every day a large supply by sea from Wales. So both Elias Ball and Henry Lawrence have no doubt about what the principal source of Negro cloth was. It lies in mid-Wales, and Shrewsbury is a critical entry point into the production zone. Well, that leads us into three questions I now want to address. Firstly, why did woolens from Wales become so significant? Why was it Wales? What was it about Wales that led to this? Secondly, why do Welsh exports decline? Why aren't we today talking about Welsh plains as being a major industry? And thirdly, I think very importantly for us, why is Negro cloth so poorly remembered? Why are we trying to take this subject from the margins more into the centre of the history that we want to talk about? Let's start with the first of those questions. Why mid-Wales? Why is this in a production zone? And I think to understand that, we need to think in terms of what became fashionable to call in the 1970s proto-industrialisation, or rural industry, domestic manufactures out in the countryside. Why does industry spring up in the early modern countryside? Well, the answer that historians started to make in the 1970s is that as population grew in poor rural areas, there was a great deal of cheap, underemployed labour. This was particularly true in cold, damp, pastoral areas in the uplands, where the agricultural calendar had slack periods built into it. So therefore you have a domestic workforce, as it were. And if you provide them with cheap technology, and most of the technology for producing textiles could be made quite cheaply out of wood, they could produce yarn or wool or woolens quite cheaply. So the technology is affordable. The links to international markets cannot easily be achieved because these people are living in quite thinly spread, isolated areas. That function is performed by urban merchants of the sort you will find thriving in Shrewsbury, and they can supply materials and credit to these workers out in the field, and quite often reduce them to a form of debt payonage. So there's a kind of exploitative situation going on there. And we know something about this from the excellent work of Melvin Humphreys, who takes us into what was going on in Montgomeryshire in the 18th century, and he paints a picture of gathering social crisis, of impoverishment on the part of the workforce, of the agricultural rural workforce, who take up industrial production as a response to that. This is a survival mechanism. What does he have to say? Spinning and weaving is taken up by the labouring poor, threatened by growing dependence on the returns of day labour and the faltering cottage economy. Small farmers are also putting up lean-to weaving sheds against the places where they live, where they farm, in response to an economic terrain that became increasingly unyielding as the various demands of rents, taxes, rates and tithes outpaced returns from agriculture. So, in the middle of the 18th century, a growing proportion, it would seem, of the rural population of Montgomeryshire is devoting itself to textiles productions, producing fairly simple and cheap woolens that can be directed towards export markets. We know that in the 17th century the principal export markets had been in Northern Europe. This is what the Shrewsbury drapers specialised in. But in the 18th century it seems to be the case, although this needs to be mapped out in far greater detail, that the most important markets are those that are transatlantic and are principally in slave societies in the Caribbean and British North America. So we have growth there. Why then do we subsequently have decline? I think there are 2 or 3 interrelated answers. Firstly, emancipation in the British Caribbean. In August 1834, when the 800,000 enslaved workers in the Caribbean are declared to be free, they of course have a choice in what they wear. And that breaks up what had previously been a fairly monolithic market, dominated by the yearly orders sent back from Jamaica, say, to London for big batches of Welsh plains or Negro cloth. So greater consumer choice in the Caribbean starts to disrupt that market that had once been fairly sure. More importantly than that, perhaps, in the United States, which was a far larger and far more dynamic market in the 1820s and the 1830s, the Welsh product is faced by growing competition on the part of American woolen producers in New England, who are starting to supply the American South. And the Welsh product is increasingly excluded, both by tariff walls and by being undercut by the growing mechanisation of the American woolen industry. The net result of all of that is societal crisis in Mid Wales by the 1830s, the 1840s. It is no coincidence that Mid Wales is a centre of violent opposition to the New Poor Law of 1834, to think about the workhouses in Mid Wales at that time. It is no accident that Mid Wales is a hotbed of Chartism, of a form of demand for more democratic government in the 1830s, because this is a society that is on the brink. And therefore the decline of Welsh woolens isn't just a kind of by way of industrial history. It tells us more about the state of Mid Wales in the early Victorian period as a whole. Okay, so that's the rough outlines of what we know. We need to know a great deal more, but it's also worth asking in this situation, why don't we know about this in the first place? Why has this story been neglected for so long? And it seems to me there are a number of reasons. And the principal reason we have to look at is who's going to tell the story? Who's going to be the narrator here? And it could be that this is a story going to be told by the people who themselves produced Welsh plains. But that's really not a viable option, because the heartland of Welsh plains production in Mid Wales is undergoing this crisis in the mid-19th century, a crisis that of course is characterised by outmigration, by fall in population. The population of Montgomeryshire, for instance, increases very rapidly in the 18th century in this period of boom. It increases in the early 19th century, really quite substantially as well. From 1841, it starts to decline. And by the late Victorian period, that decline is starting to accelerate. So the people on the ground who might have told the story, or whose sort of next generation might have told the story, are disappearing. Added to that, there is a new Welsh woolen industry coming into being, not in the traditional heartland in Mid Wales, but down here in South West Wales. And that industry is organised on a completely different basis. It is also orientated on a completely different market. And that is industrial South Wales. Welsh woolens are still being made for workwear, only in this case it's workwear in the industrial South. And I'd recommend in this particular the work of Professor Pat Hudson at Cardiff University, who has unpacked this story very, very effectively indeed. So you have another story about Welsh woolens, not in mid Wales, but in the southwest of Wales, and that's the one that now dominates our consciousness. It's no coincidence that Wales has a national wool museum, but it's not in Montgomeryshire, it's in Carmarthenshire. And the only story they're really telling is the story of that locality, of the late 19th, early 20th century industry in southwest Wales. Okay, so the people themselves either weren't into the position or didn't have the disposition to tell the story of Negro cloth, of Welsh woolens. Why not the historical profession itself within Wales? Well, the answer to that, or I think one of the answers I've learned from Neil Evans, the kind of historiographer royal of Wales, is that when the Welsh historical profession comes into being as a modern recognisable profession, it goes through two phases. In the early 20th century, Welsh historians are overwhelmingly devoted to the study of medieval Wales, particularly to the period of independence and then the loss of independence after the Edwardian conquest. Then a second wave of expansion and professionalisation takes place in the 1960s and the 1970s. And at that point, the rising generation of Welsh historians are devoted instead to what's going on in the South Wales coalfield, to the modernisation of Wales, to the insurrectionary, radical, dramatic story of what happens in South Wales on the coalfield in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And for perfectly good reasons, because it's a very dramatic and important story to tell. But the net outcome of all of that is that the 18th century and rural Wales really gets pushed into the margins. It's neglected by the historical profession. There are other people, though, who could have told the story, but they fail to do so or choose to tell it in a different kind of way. And I'm thinking here of the kind of anthropologists and human geographers that were particularly gathered around University of Aberystwyth in the interwar period and the immediate post-war years. And they had a different type of take on what happens in mid-Wales. This, I think, is a representative work, Alwyn D. Rees, Life in a Welsh Countryside, about a Montgomeryshire parish. And the kind of story that scholars of this type are telling is that what we have here is a folk culture. What we're looking at in mid-Wales is a kind of unsullied cultural tradition, untouched really by the outside world. These are essentially isolated communities that have to be understood as almost removed from the modern world. And they were lucky that they were removed from the modern world, because the modern world was rubbish. Modern life is rubbish was the story of this particular school of thought. Don't take my word for it. Let's hear from one of himself, H.J. Fleur, a very distinguished human geographer of the mid-20th century, and he likes the idea that mid-Wales is poor. It's a great thing. Poverty has been a safeguard of that intensely democratic feeling which is such a feature of modern Wales, as well as a help towards the survival of the language and its associations. In other words, what we have here is an unsullied kind of cultural half that should be protected, and they're damn lucky they're living on jam and bread. So this group isn't taking the view that impoverishment in the 18th century was a stimulus to industrial activity and growing links with the outside world. On the contrary, they viewed poverty as being enclosing, isolating, and probably that was a positive outcome. The one other institution within Wales that could have taken a different view and could have taken another narrative turn didn't do so, because it pretty much shared that story. And I'm thinking of the National Museum of Wales. And there is one overwhelmingly important person here, and he's pictured here. This is Iorwerth C. Peat, the inventor, as it were, of the National Folk Museum, as he had it in St Fagans. And he shared this view that mid-Wales was a timeless place that had been passed by modern life. And the danger was that modern life was creeping into it. He thought he was living in what he called the age of trash. So this is essentially an anti-modernist view, that modern life is rubbish, that the kind of place he was brought up in, a parish in Montgomeryshire, was the real Wales. The other varieties of Wales, like South Wales, were mongrelized societies that weren't worthy of the name, and the kind of endeavour that he was embarked upon at St Fagans was, as the title of the original title of the museum suggests, was a folk museum, not a museum of Welsh life in all its varieties. It was a particular pristine view of Welsh Wales that had to be preserved. So for all these reasons, there are different constituencies that are not willing or predisposed to tell the story of Welsh Plains, to tell a story of Wales that was kind of outward looking and internationally connected. There are a number of constituencies that instead had a great deal of investment in arguing that Wales was inward looking and beneficially isolated. So the great thing about what we're trying to do, those of us gathered in this room, is to try and tell a different history, and I need conclude on no more than suggest that, oh sorry, my title is out of date here, I'm still behind the times, I'm clinging to an old history, Welsh Plains. I shall update that slide. But the kind of initiative that we have been introduced to this morning that is going to try and rebuild a history of Welsh Plains and the international aspects of that history from the ground up is an endeavour whose time has come, I think. So thank you very much.